You get the call at 2:47 in the morning. You don't recognize the number. You never do. But you pick up anyway because you always pick up. A voice you know says 3 words. Just 3. And you're already out of bed, pulling on your coat, checking the chamber of the pistol you keep in the drawer next to your passport. You don't ask questions. Fixers don't ask questions. That's the first thing you learned, and it's the only rule that matters. You weren't always this. There was a version of you that existed before. A lawyer, maybe, or an intelligence officer, or a military man with medals and a family and a mortgage. That person followed rules. That person believed in institutions. That person is gone now, and you barely remember him. What you are now doesn't have a clean title. The world calls people like you many things: cleaner, fixer, shadow, operator, the man who makes problems disappear. Your employer calls you an advisor. That's the word on paper anyway. The truth is something the paper will never hold. Your employer is the kind of man whose name appears in newspapers only when his lawyers allow it. He controls energy pipelines across 3 continents. He owns politicians in 7 countries without technically breaking the laws of any of them. He has dinner with heads of state. He funds revolutions and funds the suppression of revolutions, depending on the quarter. He is one of perhaps 20 people alive on this planet who can make a phone call and rearrange the borders of nations. And he has chosen you to be the hand he never shows. You've been doing this for 11 years. You know where the bodies are buried. In some cases, that's not a metaphor. It begins the way it always begins: a problem. Someone has done something that threatens the architecture of his empire. Maybe it's a journalist who has gotten too close to a story about offshore accounts and shell companies in places where money goes to die quietly. Maybe it's a business partner who has decided that loyalty is less valuable than a competing offer from a rival. Maybe it's a government minister who was bought and paid for and has decided inexplicably to grow a conscience. Or maybe it's something worse, something that lives below the surface of what can be spoken about in any meeting room. Something that, if it reached the light of day, would not just embarrass the empire, but detonate it. You fly first class. You always fly first class. Not because you care about comfort, but because the people in first class ask fewer questions about why you're traveling. You carry 2 passports. One is real. The other is also real, issued by a country that cooperates with certain people for certain purposes. You have a legend, a background story that holds up to moderate scrutiny, not deep scrutiny. If someone runs your second name through the serious databases, things get complicated. But most people don't run serious databases on men in business suits who tip generously and drink whiskey with quiet confidence. You land in a city. It doesn't matter which one. They blur after a while. The airports, the hotel lobbies, the meetings in glass towers, and underground restaurants. What matters is the job. The job this time is a man, a former associate of your employer who left the arrangement under circumstances that were not amicable. He took something when he left, not money, something worse: documents. Specifically, a set of communications between your employer and 3 sitting government officials in a country that is currently in the middle of a very sensitive negotiation with the European Union. The contents of those communications would be described by journalists as explosive. They would be described by prosecutors as evidence. Your employer describes them as property. Your job is to retrieve the property. Your employer does not say what happens after. You don't ask. You find the man through a network of contacts who exist in the spaces between things. Not quite criminal, not quite government, not quite private. The men and women who traffic in information. A retired signals intelligence officer in Warsaw who still has access to things he's not supposed to. A customs official in Vienna who flags certain names. A source inside Interpol who is not working for Interpol as much as working for people who find Interpol useful. You pay everyone in cash or in favors, and the favors are always more valuable. The man is in a city in southern Europe. He's been there for 6 weeks. He has a lawyer, and he has copies of the documents stored in multiple locations, which is smart of him. People who are afraid of your employer tend to be smart about redundancy. They learn this instinct quickly, or they don't get the chance to learn anything at all. You meet him in a cafe. You sit across from him over espresso, and you speak in the calm, reasonable register of a man negotiating a business dispute. Because that's what this is, on the surface, a business dispute. He looks at you, and he knows what you are, and you can see in his eyes that he's calculating. Can I trust this man? Is this a real offer? Or is this the last conversation I'll ever have? You let him calculate. You let the silence do its work. Silence is one of your most effective tools. You make the offer. It's generous. Your employer is willing to pay significantly for the return of the documents and for the man's permanent relocation to a country where his cooperation can be quietly ensured. The man says he'll think about it. You say that's fine. You say he has 72 hours. You say it the way you'd say, enjoy your lunch. With complete casualness, as if the alternative to his cooperation is simply an abstract concept rather than something you've already arranged for. He gives you the documents on the 3rd day, all copies, as far as you can verify. A technical team your employer maintains checks the metadata, checks the cloud backups, sweeps the man's devices. Clean, they say. You pay him. He boards a flight to his new life. You file no report because there are no reports. There is no paper trail that leads back to any of this. There is only the result, and the result is that the problem is gone. This is most of the work. People imagine the life of a fixer to be cinematic. Car chases, assassinations, explosions in the dark. The reality is that 90% of what you do is invisible. It's the meeting that prevents the lawsuit. It's the phone call that ensures the investigation goes sideways. It's the envelope delivered to the right person at the right time. It's the carefully worded conversation with a man who runs a media company, explaining to him in terms he clearly understands why a certain story should not run. Power, real power, doesn't usually announce itself with violence. Violence is what power uses when everything else has failed, and by that point, something has already gone wrong. But sometimes, things go wrong. You've been in situations that you don't think about in daylight. 3 years ago, there was a man in a hotel room in a country that you won't name. And what happened in that room is one of those events that lives in a sealed compartment in your memory. You open it sometimes at 4 a.m., not because you want to, but because the lock isn't always reliable. The man had information. He refused to give it. The methods that were applied were not yours. You were there to oversee, not to implement. But you stood in that room, and you did not stop it. And so the distinction between observing and participating means very little in the moral accounting of the universe. You've made your peace with that. Or You've told yourself you have, which is the closest thing to peace that a person in your position can access. Your employer is not a simple villain. That's what makes this complicated, and it's what makes your position complicated. He is not a cartoon. He is a man of genuine intelligence who has constructed an argument, a worldview, in which what he does is not only justified, but necessary. He believes that the world runs on power, and that the exercise of power by men like him is preferable to the alternatives. He is not entirely wrong. You have seen the alternatives. You have been to the places where power vacuums exist, where the absence of organized control means not freedom, but chaos. He funds hospitals. He funds infrastructure in countries that governments have abandoned. He employs hundreds of thousands of people. The accounting of his good and evil is not simple arithmetic. You think about this often because your mind needs a framework, and the framework he offers is the most coherent one available to you. But you are not naive. You know what he is underneath the hospitals and the employment statistics. You know the names of people who died because of decisions he made. You know the politician who was driven from office through a campaign of engineered scandal that you helped design. You know the election that went a certain direction because of money that moved through channels you helped build. You know all of this, and you continue because the alternative of walking away, of becoming someone else, seems more impossible to you with every year that passes. People who leave arrangements like this don't usually leave cleanly. You know this because part of your job is to manage people who try. The man in Southern Europe is a best-case scenario. He accepted the offer. Others haven't. There was a woman, an accountant who worked for a firm that handled certain accounts, who decided that her conscience required her to speak to investigators. She was not harmed. She was simply made unreliable. Her history was carefully revised. A pattern of behavior was documented and introduced into the record. And by the time she sat across from the investigators had already concluded that she was not a credible witness. You did not hurt her. You simply made it so that nothing she said could land. The distinction mattered to you once. You're not sure it still does. Your employer calls you his shadow. He says it fondly, the way a man might refer to a valuable instrument. You are not his friend. You are not, despite the years and the shared secrets, his confidant in any personal sense. You are a function. You know this. He knows this. The arrangement works because neither of you pretends otherwise. He is warm to you in the way that powerful men are warm to people they find useful. Genuinely, for now, for as long as the utility persists. You think sometimes about what happens when the utility ends, when you're too old or too compromised, or when the arrangement concludes in whatever way arrangements like this conclude. There is a house in a country that has no extradition treaty with the countries most likely to want to ask you questions. There is money in accounts that don't have your name on them. You have made preparations. You've made them quietly and carefully over years, because a fixer who doesn't plan his own exit is a fixer who has misunderstood his position. But you also know that preparations can fail. You know this because you've undone other people's preparations. You know the ways that carefully constructed escape plans come apart. The digital trace that was overlooked. The trusted intermediary who was not as loyal as assumed. The jurisdiction that proved more cooperative than anticipated. You know all the ways this ends badly. You think about them the way a chess player thinks about the end game, not with panic, but with clear, cold attention to the variables. There's a new problem now. There's always a new problem. A senator in a country with significant regulatory power over one of your employer's energy assets has initiated an investigation. The investigation is legitimate, meaning it emerged from actual evidence rather than a political maneuver by a rival. This is more difficult to manage than the political kind. Political investigations are navigated through political channels. You find the pressure points in the investigators' coalition. You apply pressure. The investigation loses momentum. Legitimate investigations require different tools. You need to know what they know and whether what they know is enough. You need to know who is feeding them information, because somewhere there is a source, and sources are human, and humans have vulnerabilities. You fly to the city. You meet with a lawyer who is one of a network of attorneys your employer maintains. People who are technically independent, but whose independence has certain practical limits. The lawyer gives you a detailed brief on the investigation's scope, obtained through methods that are not technically legal, but are also not the kind of thing that gets prosecuted when applied carefully. The scope is significant. They have documents. They have testimony from a former employee. They have financial records that a year ago you thought were secure. You go to work. The work takes 4 months. In those 4 months, you travel to 6 cities. You have 47 meetings that no calendar records. You make 3 payments through channels that don't exist on paper. You have 2 conversations that end with people clearly understanding what they stand to lose if they continue on their current trajectory. You make 1 phone call that results in a key witness deciding that their cooperation with investigators is not in their best interest. The investigation doesn't end. Investigations rarely end completely, but it narrows and slows and becomes something that can be managed. Something that will conclude without reaching the conclusions that would be dangerous. You sit in a hotel bar on the last night before you fly home, and you drink a single glass of whiskey, and you look at your reflection in the darkened window, and you think about the version of yourself that filled out a law school application, or a military academy application, or whatever the origin story is. The beginning that led by a series of reasonable seeming steps to this particular stool, in this particular bar, in this particular life. Every step made sense at the time. Every choice had a logic. And here you are, your phone buzzes. A message from your employer. 2 words, well done. You put the phone in your pocket. You finish the whiskey. You leave the bar. Outside, the city moves around you. People going to restaurants, going home, living lives that are bounded by ordinary stakes, lost wallets, and difficult bosses, and arguments with spouses, and medical bills, and the ordinary human machinery of consequence and care. You move through it like a ghost, adjacent to it. You left that world a long time ago, and you're not sure the door back exists anymore. Somewhere, a new problem is forming. A journalist is asking questions. A government is shifting its posture. A partner is considering disloyalty. The machine that is your employer's empire produces problems the way an engine produces heat, constantly, as a natural byproduct of its operation. And as long as the engine runs, there is work for you. You get on the plane. You put on your headphones. You close your eyes. The city falls away below you. You're already thinking about the next problem.